Good afternoon, and welcome to NYMTC, Program Finance and Administration Committee, or feedback. I'm Ian Francis, representative of New York State Department of Transportation, and today's chair of feedback. Before we begin, I want to point out the emergency exits. Should there be an emergency evacuation? There are 3 exits. There's one directly behind you, one on the wall to my left, and further to the wall to my left is another exit. Please listen for announcements and instructions. If anyone needs personal assistance to evacuate, notify NYMTC staff. Can NYMTC staff please raise their hand? Thank you. I would also ask that everyone mute their cell phones during the meeting. Now I'd like to begin the meeting with introductions of members around the table. I'm asking each member to announce who they are, their agency, and whom they are representing today. Beginning with the far end of the table to my left. Please speak clearly into the microphone.
Dan Moser, Federal Transit Administration, representing Region 2 Administrator Stephen Goodman.
Zadamani, Federal Highway Administration, New York Division, representing Division Administrator Rick Markey.
Hannah Greenberg, EPA, representing Regional Administrator Peter Lopez.
Brooklyn, representing Manhattan County Executive Laura.
Chris Chatterton, Suffolk County, representing County Executive Steve Ballone.
Jack Schmidt, New York City Department of City Planning, representing City Planning Commission Chair Marisa Lago.
Ann McGrane, New York City Department of Transportation, representing Commissioner Polly Trottenberg. Julia Seltzer from MTA, representing Chairman Pat Foy.
Naomi Klein, Westchester County, representing County Executive George Latimer.
Sandra Fusco, Putnam County, representing County Executive Mary Ellen O'Dell.
Gordon, Rockland County, representing County Executive Dave. Steve Brown, Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, representing Executive Director Rick Cotton.
Thank you. By my count, under our operating procedures, we have a quorum for today's meeting. We'll begin our meeting today with a presentation on goods delivery research. Jared Bogaz will introduce the speaker.
Good afternoon. We're happy to have Alison Conway with us today. She's an associate professor of civil engineering at the City College of New York, where she teaches courses in transportation planning, transportation systems engineering, urban freight, and city logistics. She's also a member of the research team for MetroFreight, which we'll hear a little bit about today, a Volvo Research and Education Foundation Center of Excellence in Urban Freight. Dr. Conway conducts research primarily in the areas of urban freight and city logistics, freight data, and multimodal interactions in the urban environment. I had the pleasure of hearing one of Alison's presentations last spring at a supply chain conference. I think her research is very exciting and very, very necessary right now as we all struggle to handle what's changing in the world of goods movement. So with that being said, I'd like to introduce Dr. Conway.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. So I'm going to introduce first, as Jerry mentioned, most of my research on this topic has been conducted under the MetroFreight Center, which is a Volvo Center of Excellence in Urban Freight. It's actually a partnership of 4 cities. Los Angeles, we're led by the University of Southern California, and Cal State Long Beach, the Metrans Transportation Center. Our other partners include ISTAR in Paris, COTI in Seoul, and then UTRC here in New York City. The work I'm going to be talking about today has been conducted primarily by myself and Dr. Camille Conga at City College in the Department of Civil Engineering. I'm also going to be sharing some results from research by Dr. Jean-Paul Rodriguez, who is in the Department of Global Studies and Geography at Hofstra University. And Jean-Paul is a internationally recognized expert in supply chain organization for both marine and all kinds of freight transportation systems. So he's done some really interesting work at sort of the larger scale, understanding the bigger patterns that are happening in supply chain organizations. So before I get started, just to sort of put in very simple terms the scope of the problem we're trying to understand, when we think about traditional supply chains, when we talk about people purchasing consumer goods, this was a relatively easy problem to try to measure. Not that the data is always readily available, but basically we had simple movements from warehouses to retail stores and then personal shopping trips to retail stores. So with household survey information, establishment survey information, we could do a relatively good job of estimating the trips that are being generated and the traffic activity associated with those kinds of movements. Over the last 10 years, as everyone in the room knows, e-commerce has rapidly taken over. We now have something that looks like this, and we're trying to measure what's happening. So we no longer have this one major large distribution center from which we're getting deliveries to retail stores and these simple movements from home to store. Now we have a large complex network of warehousing facilities. Some of those goods are going direct from those warehousing facilities to home. Some of them are going to stores and then home. Some people are going to shop in stores but not actually buying in stores and getting things delivered because they can find a better price online after they've seen it in the store. And so what we're trying to do is just get a handle on, one, how are the organization of supply chains changing because of e-commerce, and really in the end, what does that mean for travel demand and the externalities associated with travel demand in our city. So just to put it, again, relatively simply, we can estimate the number of packages arriving to an address relatively easily. We have the U.S. Postal Service does a household survey. Even some regional household surveys ask this type of information. The National Household Travel Survey in its last round asked this type of information. The challenge is then taking that number of parcels and converting it back into transportation activity. And in order to understand that association, we need to know several things that we can't get from that household survey. We need to know what was the lot size when that package was delivered. Was one package delivered at a time? Were 10 packages dropped off at once? What type of vehicle were they actually on when they were delivered? What time of day were they delivered? Most people, you know, I can say that a package was delivered to me, but if it arrived while I was at work, I have no idea what time of day that package actually arrived. And then ultimately, where did that package come from? Where's the warehouse that it came from? We can see some of that information personally. If I log on to the UPS or FedEx with my tracking number, I can see where those activities are happening. But where the truck actually traveled on that trip to my home is not an easy thing to measure. So we go from this number of packages. We can estimate, if we know the time of day of arrival and the type of vehicle and the number of packages on a vehicle, we can estimate parking demand. To understand the VMT impacts, we really need to know where are those packages coming from and how is that supply chain organized. And so we were hearing a lot in the news. There was a big New York Times article a couple of weeks ago about the traffic congestion being generated by e-commerce. You know, the short answer is on-demand e-commerce is very inefficient compared to other types of delivery, but the actual effect it's having on VMT is very much dependent on what are the trips being traded off and what type of delivery. And so we've tried to answer essentially 4 big questions, and these are color-coded. The ones in blue I've got a lot to say about already. I would say the work is still ongoing, but we have some pretty interesting conclusions. The orange is what we're trying to do right now, and again, I'm going to talk about all these projects, and the things in red are things that what we really want to know, but I don't think we're quite there to answer those questions in detail yet. So I'm going to talk today about results from 5 projects. Don't worry, I'm not going to give a 20-minute presentation on each of these. I'm just going to hit the key findings from each of these. And again, these were projects that were conducted, again, looking at the supply chain organization, looking at the actual local activity that's occurring, and then trying to get a handle on those trade-offs that are happening. What's the data that we're using? Data about local goods movements is notoriously lacking. So we've tried to be creative with the types of data that we're using to get at these questions. So as you can see on the slide, we're working with a lot of different things. Jean-Paul's study looking at the supply chain actually mapped an inventory of all of the Amazon facilities in the United States over time so that we can understand, one, what's the growth in the number of facilities, but also things like the size of the facilities, the location of the facilities, and what does that mean. In terms of local activity, one project, again, led by Jean-Paul, actually uses building delivery records. Any of you who live in a large apartment complex probably have a management system now where your packages are logged in at the front desk. This is essentially using that data to understand the packages that are arriving. It is a sample size of one building, so it's a single building, but we can see some really interesting trends from that. My study tried to look at 8 different buildings. Again, large-scale apartment buildings. We looked at 8 buildings in 4 boroughs. Apologies to Staten Island. The only reason Staten Island is not included is that my students who were doing the data collection had to be there at 7 a.m., lived in Bronx and Queens, and getting them to Staten Island by 7 a.m. was kind of complicated matter. We actually observed, basically the students stood in front of the buildings and observed every vehicle arriving, every package coming through the door, and collected the variables you can see. We then took that information and tried to use it to estimate at a high level with some sensitivity analysis where the parking demand is being generated for this actual activity, and then mapped it using New York City DOT's database to compare with where the existing commercial vehicle parking actually is compared to the demand for this type of package delivery, which really wasn't considered 10 years ago or 20 years ago when we were thinking about parking regulations. The last study, and this is one that's ongoing right now, we're very excited when New York City released the Citywide Mobility Survey, which includes a trip diary, but it also included a state of preference survey, which includes questions about the frequency of deliveries. And the survey provides information at the neighborhood level, even the zip code level. So we are in the process of developing some models, trying to understand how demographics and built environment factors affect the frequency of deliveries. We can already see that there's some big differences across the city, even within different city neighborhoods, in how people are getting deliveries. We're supplementing that with open data sets, so things like New York State grocery store licenses. We have the address of every licensed grocery store in the state, so we can map those and look at how close are those to people's homes, so we can understand how that's affecting their frequency of delivery, and ultimately what's the trade-off if they get a delivery instead of go to a local store. So what I'm going to do is run through the very key findings from these projects and then summarize what do we know and what do we don't know at this point. So first, this is a map from Jean-Paul's work of the Amazon e-commerce facilities as of 2019. So you can see Amazon has 441 warehouses in the U.S. With a total footprint of, almost 159 million square feet of warehousing space. You can see different types of facilities. So even 20 years ago, when we first started moving into e-commerce, the primary facility was that e-fulfillment center, which is a large warehouse, usually located in a suburban or even exurban area. Again, if you think of the New York region, we've still got massive growth happening with e-fulfillment centers. That growth is moving further and further away from the region. So the Lehigh Valley of Pennsylvania is one of the fastest growing warehouse regions in the country. That's because of growth in the type of large-scale warehouse where we need to store a lot of goods. But the other trend that we're seeing is growth in on-demand deliveries. So now, again, using Amazon as an example, if you live in parts of this region, you can get 1-hour deliveries from Amazon. If you were going to expect your goods from Amazon to be delivered with 1 hour, and you live in Manhattan, the warehouse better not be on the other side of Lincoln Tunnel or on the other side of the East River. It needs to be right in the heart of the city. And so that's where these fast delivery hubs are starting to pop up right in the center of the central business district. And there's tremendous interest in any open commercial warehouse space in this region for this type of on-demand activity now. So I'm not going to go through every example on the slide, but what you can see is there's this whole network of facilities going from large scale down to very small scale in order to meet these on-demand deliveries. There's a role for the U.S. Postal Service. Sometimes the U.S. Postal Service plays a role in moving those goods from the e-fulfillment center, in which case they go through a post office. If they are on-demand deliveries coming from another part of the country, there's a growing role for air transportation in the movement of these on-demand goods. So these are kind of the big picture trends that are happening. And so Jean-Paul actually mapped the warehousing space, dedicate it to these different types of facilities, and identified essentially 4 eras of e-commerce so far. The first was when e-commerce first started arriving. That's when we were still mostly ordering out of catalogs, but occasionally you could order something online. Then, you know, during that second period, e-commerce really started to take off as a means of ordering goods, but still had not reached kind of the detailed network integration that was necessary for what we have today. The third era was the era of horizontal integration. That's where we started seeing a lot of mergers of e-commerce, you know, again, to not keep mentioning the behemoths, but, you know, firms merging, firms acquiring each other. So now we've got these very large-scale networks. And now with on-demand, we're actually seeing vertical integration. So Amazon, about I think in 2017, prior to 2017, Amazon was primarily working with the large-scale parcel carriers like UPS and FedEx and the U.S. Postal Service. Starting in about 2017, Amazon started primarily managing their own supply chains. So now when you get an Amazon delivery, it's much less likely to arrive on a UPS truck. It's more likely to arrive in unmarked white vans operated by a local carrier. You know, the extreme example is man with a van. Even during the holiday season, they have Amazon Flex where you, as a private citizen, can sign up to use your private car to go make a delivery for Amazon. So there's been this diversification of who's actually making the deliveries and an increase in the role of small local operators in doing so. So those are big picture what's happening at the regional level. Now, the next 3 projects looked at local delivery activities. So first, we have our building delivery information from Fort Lee. Again, this is a single building, but it shows that we can look at some really interesting trends. So you can see monthly delivery frequencies. We can look at the seasonality of those deliveries, relatively stable over the whole year with a peak at the holiday season. I don't think this graph is probably very surprising to anyone in the room. We can also look at weekly deliveries. Weekly deliveries, again, over this 5-year period, you can see a pretty stable pattern of when the peaks are arriving during the week. The one exception to that is that there is an increasing number, particularly if you look at Sunday, in these weekend deliveries and packages that would be arriving on a Sunday. This graph shows year-over-year parcel delivery growth rates. So you can see at the top during these 3 years, the average by month of what's the growth rate in the number of parcels arriving. So the average across the year is about 15% in 2017. You can see it's a little bit lower in 2018 with that August value being very low. But then you can see in 2019, again, we're back up to about that 14% average. And August is a huge spike because of the low value in the year before. So, you know, again, this is a sample size of 1, but these growth rates appear to be pretty much tracking with growth in e-commerce as e-commerce retail sales. Basically, the number of packages is tracking with the growth in the sales. Again, this is just from this building. It shows the parcel delivery time. You can see most of these parcels to this building are arriving in the early afternoon. Why is this interesting? Because this is a very different pattern than what we think of as traditional commercial freight. So if you're delivering to a retail store or to a restaurant, those deliveries tend to happen, you know, maybe between 7 and 10 a.m. before the stores open, maybe in the evening, late at night. These types of deliveries are happening right in the middle of the day. And again, this is a phenomenon I already mentioned. You can see with Amazon the number of deliveries. This is a breakdown at this building of how the deliveries are actually arriving by carrier. You can see the biggest carrier is the U.S. Postal Service and remains the U.S. Postal Service. But you can see as Amazon has started operating their own independent supply chains, you can see they have a growing role over this time. Okay, so that was what we saw by looking at one building. Now, these are some results. These are the 8 locations of the buildings that we actually observed in New York City. So you can see we have one in the Upper East Side and one downtown in Manhattan, one in Williamsburg on sort of the new waterfront development area, and one in downtown Brooklyn. and then again in the Bronx and Queens. So delivery frequencies, if you look at the graphs on the right, this is something that's interesting to note as we try to convert these number of packages into a number of truck trips. You can see this is a very basic time distribution of number of vehicle arrivals and the number of package arrivals. And you can see this peak is the same as John Paul's data, which is in the afternoon is when the most packages are arriving. However, that's not necessarily when the most vehicles are arriving. What's happening with the packages is those early afternoon trips are the U.S. Postal Service and FedEx and UPS arriving with a truckload full of vehicles to that location, whereas the vehicles throughout the day might be the local grocery store, a laundromat, any other independent operator. So again, we have to be careful in trying to equate parcels with vehicles. So across the buildings we looked at, we saw 295 total deliveries. I thought it was really interesting that it was almost exactly half were meals. We weren't interested in the meals for the purpose of this activity, so we removed the meal deliveries and analyzed the rest. That being said, our other deliveries do include groceries. They do include things like Blue Apron that are those curated boxes that come as a parcel but are not from a local restaurant. Interesting, when we look across the 8 buildings, there was a fair amount of variability in the frequency of deliveries. Daily vehicle trips in the highest trip generating buildings, there was basically one truck trip generated for every 7 apartments in that building. And at the lower end of the spectrum was 1 per 21 units. So basically, there were 3 times as many trips being generated by the buildings, the highest buildings, than there were by the lowest buildings. Same thing with packages. The highest generating buildings were generating about 4 times as many packages as the lowest generating buildings. From really basic information we have about these buildings, we expect that there's some income and other demographic factors that are affecting those. That is not something this data set allowed us to analyze in detail. That's something we're trying to look at right now in the work that we're doing, and I'll revisit that topic in a second. Interestingly, the temporal patterns were not the same across every building. So depending on the location of that building and its vicinity to the UPS warehouse and where it fell in the UPS store, the peaks might fall at a different time of day. Another thing that we found is interesting, we looked at the vehicles that were actually arriving to make these deliveries. And I should preface this with this data is from 2017, which means that in the world of e-commerce it is already severely outdated, but the trends are continuing, they're just getting more extreme. So if you look at the 8 buildings that we observed, this is a breakdown of the vehicles that were actually arriving with those packages. And you can see in the Bronx and Queens, most of what was moving was still moving by what we would traditionally think of as freight vehicles. So either single unit trucks, mostly step vans, and mostly cargo vans. In the more dense parts of the city that we observed, particularly in Brooklyn and Manhattan, we are starting to see a much bigger share of those goods arriving by other modes, so bicycles, hand carts, and passenger cars. I will caveat the hand cart particularly with most of this activity is probably coming from a truck parked a couple blocks away, but we could not actually see the truck. So what that means is that in these areas, there is what we call micro-distribution happening, where a truck is parking somewhere in the neighborhood and is essentially using their truck as a mobile distribution center from which they're conducting these hand cart deliveries. Another thing we're interested in is how long do these vehicles park? Again, you can see for those 2 types of deliveries, there's 2 peaks in this graph. Most of these deliveries are pretty quick. You just have a package, they go in the door, they deliver it, they come out. It's a very short parking trip. But we also did see this micro-distribution activity where the truck would park for long periods of time and serve multiple buildings from that one location. Another thing we looked at is where, and again, this is 8 locations, so it's a small sample data set, but where do these vehicles park? I think the important thing to note is that one little green slice of that pie, 13%, is the ones that were actually legally parked in a legal parking spot, which means, everyone else was parking in a place that was either questionable or absolutely not legal location to be parking. So this kind of piqued our interest into why is this happening. So one last thing before I move on to talking about parking, we did try to take, using these different vehicle types and the number of packages they were actually delivering, and try to develop a metric on how efficiently those vehicles are using space to deliver those parcels. And the big finding here is, again, surprising probably to no one, the most efficient movements are those that are happening on those traditional UPS and FedEx and USPS trucks where you've got a step van arriving with many vehicles. The problem is this is not the direction our economy is moving, where people are requesting 1 hour and 2 hour deliveries of things. Those are not going to arrive on an efficient vehicle, they're going to arrive on a small vehicle. Now there might be some benefit to those small vehicles if we're talking about things like bicycles in a well-connected network where they're able to access. But if we're talking about taking one truck and replacing it with 12 passenger cars, there's going to be a huge loss in efficiency. So on the parking side, what we did is we took these distributions and we tried to map based on USPS package delivery demand, again, very basic estimates using income to try to predict what number of packages would be delivered, convert those using our distribution to actual curb length of parking space demanded during discrete time periods of the day. And then I had an awesome PhD student, Shen Chen, who took the New York City DOT data database and wrote a program to essentially quantify the length of curb space with specific types of parking regulations and extracted the dedicated commercial parking spaces in every census tract in the city. And then we overlaid the expected demand on that actual existing commercial demand. This does not include any commercial use of that space other than residential delivery demand. So that means we're not talking about trips to stores, we're not talking about plumbers and contractors with commercial license plates, just looking at the residential demand, overlaying it on the existing parking, and we got these maps. So you can see the map in black. Any area of the map that's black means there is not a single dedicated commercial space in this census tract. And again, to caveat this for especially New York City DOT, New York City DOT last summer has started putting in these neighborhood loading zones. This is a good reason to show why those are needed, to actually have a neighborhood loading zone in some of these neighborhoods. As you can see, the problem time is not real in the morning when we traditionally had store deliveries. It's actually in the afternoon because that's when a lot of these parcel deliveries are happening. And the problem is that a lot of the supply actually goes away at that time. For example, on the Upper West Side, the locations of commercial parking is along the major avenue corridors like Columbus Avenue, Amsterdam Avenue. A lot of those are dedicated commercial parking in the morning, and then they revert to metered parking for customers later in the day at a time like 10 a.m. The problem is the UPS trucks leave the warehouse at 9:30. So by the time they arrive to the destinations where they're actually delivering these packages, they're not, there's no space left for a commercial vehicle. So this is projecting out a 15% growth rate over 5 years between 2017 and 2022. As you can see, we've got a big problem in Manhattan, north of 57th Street, in terms of what we expect in terms of demand, as well as in the parts of Brooklyn. This study actually focused just on these inner areas with, so we need to reproduce these maps at a larger regional scale. So finally, what trade-offs are being made? Again, this is research that we're really just getting started on, but I wanted to share it with you just to sort of break down the complexity of this question. So this is using the New York Citywide Mobility Survey. We created 2 groups of people. So the survey included a trip diary. It's not a perfect data set because it's only 2 days of a trip diary. So it's probably we're losing some information because it's only 2 days. And then they have a stated preference of how frequently people get deliveries. So what this graph shows, the blue lines are the number of people falling within that age category within each neighborhood among the actual survey respondents. The orange line is the share of users by age group within each neighborhood that actually made a trip to a grocery store during their 2-day time period. And then the last gray bar is the ones who self-identified as getting grocery deliveries basically a few times a month, so essentially weekly. And so what we did was just looked at, okay, what's the share of the different age groups among these 3 groups? What you can see is 25 to 34-year-olds shop online and get a lot of deliveries. But when we break it down by neighborhood, we actually see very different behavior in some of the other age groups. So among seniors in Manhattan, seniors are getting almost the same, almost the same share of seniors in the sample as the share of seniors that are actually among the people that are getting frequent deliveries of groceries. In the South Bronx, there's not a single person over the age of 65 that identified as being in that group of people that get more than 1 grocery delivery. So this is a really basic graph. The point here is just that we cannot look at this issue even at a citywide level, because looking at the citywide level, if we try to generalize for the city, we're going to lose a lot of the detail and what's actually happening. So why are these differences happening? Part of it, we think, is because of actual access to different types of land uses, and these are maps we're producing based on those secondary data sets, things like grocery density and retail density. And then this, I think, is the most, and this is my last graph, one of the most interesting things just from looking at this basic data. This has nothing to do with delivery. This is just how people actually travel based on that travel survey to the grocery store and to retail stores. You can see on the grocery store, I should have included a third graph, which is all trips. The subway is very rarely used anywhere in the city for grocery shopping. Why is that? Almost 90% of people in Manhattan walk to the grocery store. In Staten Island, it's 80% driving to the store. And you can see the spectrum. This is essentially getting from the densest parts of the city into the less dense parts of the city. Why does this matter? Because when we try to quantify the trade-offs that are happening between a trip to the grocery store and a grocery delivery, if you're replacing someone who's walking a block away in Manhattan with a truck trip, that's going to be a huge efficiency loss. If you're in Staten Island and you're replacing 6 one-way passenger trips with 1 truck, you might actually be getting an efficiency gain out of the e-commerce activity. So again, no answer yet, but this is what we're investigating right now. So just to summarize, what do we know so far? Supply chains, we have a huge growth in activity. We have more warehouses. We have a diversification of what's happening in those warehouses and where they're located. Local activity, I'm not going to read through every detail. I think we've covered. Ongoing research, we're trying to investigate these relationships with demographics and built environment factors, and in the future, there's more that we need. So the citywide mobility survey that we're using is a really awesome data set, but it's not perfect because it's not a number of deliveries versus a number of trips. And so we could use a slightly better data set if we had a full trip diary that included detailed information. Same thing on the supply chain side. We still don't have great information about the travel activity. So these are all things that we're going to be looking at in the future. With that, I'm open for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Conway. Any questions from the members?
Government agencies and also NPOs, we're also trying to figure out what type of data we need to better plan for future freight needs. Is there an obvious database that government agencies can work together to provide researchers?
So that's a tough question because, what we really need is, on the supply chain side, what we really need is information from the private sector about what's happening. I will say that there are examples internationally and even in the U.S. of some of the major carriers partnering with cities to provide data when they see the value of doing so and when they are not afraid that that data is going to be used against them. That's part of the reason why we rely so much on open data sets. We're very fortunate here in this region that New York City has a lot of open data sets that allow us to map even things like parking violations, from which we can get patterns of where the trucks are, because we get a lot of tickets. But I would say, short answer, we need more collaborative models with the private sector to develop ways to work together to get that information.
Dr. Conway, you mentioned hand cards. When you were observing it, were these hand cards issued, let's say, from major carriers like FedEx or UPS, or were they like the local drugstore delivering?
So I would say both, and I unfortunately don't have a breakdown, but there are definitely, particularly in the dense parts of the city, the major carriers like UPS and FedEx, the grocery delivery companies like Fresh Direct, just sort of stake out a parking spot somewhere in the neighborhood and then are making deliveries from that location. But there are also local grocery stores and, you know, the laundromat in the neighborhood and things like that that are also using hand cards.
Are there any questions from the audience? To my left.
Alison, can you just say a little bit about the sample size and the inferences that you can draw from this research that you've done so far?
Sure. So again, it varies by project. I would say the supply chain research, the sample size is Amazon's network. And so Amazon is a unique operator, but they are also by far the largest operator. And I would say they're also the ones who are sort of leading the market advances. So for example, in grocery stores, you know, Fresh Direct had 1- and 2-day delivery until Amazon had 2-hour delivery, and then Fresh Direct had to introduce on-demand delivery, and Jet.com had to introduce on-demand delivery to sort of keep up. And so I think what they're doing is telling, even though it doesn't cover the whole sector. In terms of the observations, obviously these are individual buildings. On the building side, it was literally a sample size of 1, a single building. But it is a full 5 years with some partial data missing at the beginning and at the very end of this year. And our field observations were 8 buildings, and it was absolutely a biased sample. We did some sensitivity analysis, and I'm happy to share the reports on that, of what the assumptions we had to make, what impact they would have. The only variable that we found once we accounted for that had a really big influence on the numbers that we got was the number of packages being delivered at each stop. So if that number is a bad estimate, it could substantially change the parking demands that we end up with. But so it's a small sample, it's only large buildings, mainly because the method of data collection was to send my undergrads to the curb to watch what was happening. And if we send them into, you know, a suburban-like neighborhood, there might be 1 truck that shows up in a 12-hour period or 2 trucks that show up in a 12-hour period. So the idea was to try to get the diversity of what's happening at these dense locations.
All right, thank you. Any more questions?
I just wanted to make the comment as the manager of the Citywide Mobility Survey that it's really great to see researchers using that survey to learn more about how the city is working and functioning, and that we should maybe connect offline to talk about ways that you think we could improve the survey in the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have a couple of questions. One of them, I think your statistics is more on delivering to apartment buildings, not to like private houses.
Right, so we exclusively looked at apartment buildings.
Is there a problem with getting statistics on the deliveries to private houses?
Yes, so for the observations that we did, the problem was just the method that we used to actually collect the data was to send students out to physically observe. And again, we could put them in front of a private house, but it would be a very expensive endeavor to get that.
Even the UPS or whatever would have, they would know when they're delivering the data, delivering whatever packages is to private houses. And I think you mentioned there was a bit of a problem with cooperation with some commercial companies. So how could we get some of these commercial companies to more work with us so that we could have better statistics, so we could try to improve the overall traffic situation and everything?
Yeah, and that's a very good point. Again, UPS and others, I have seen examples in other cities where they actually do work with the city to provide some of that information. The challenge is in narrowly defining what data is needed, in making sure that there is proper privacy protections, because that data is considered a trade secret. So to make sure that it's set up in a structure, a lot of these actually involve partnerships between public agencies, universities, and the private sector. So the public agencies don't actually ever directly touch the data. The data goes to the academic institutions who sign non-disclosure agreements but work with the city. But it's a good point, and it's something, I actually chair the TRB Freight Data Committee, so I've spent years, if not decades, talking about this issue, and it's a really important one, especially as we get into e-commerce.
Another thing is that I've noticed that, I drive sometimes at night during rush hour, and I'm seeing the sanitation department collecting the trash at that time. Now, is there a way we should better be able to coordinate so that they don't, collect the trash or do whatever while there's traffic congestion already with commercial traffic, making deliveries or, rush hour traffic? We should be able to better coordinate with the sanitation department so that their trucks are not out at a time where the streets are very, very busy anyway.
Yeah, no, that's another good point, and, I'm not an expert on sanitation, so I'm not going to speak a lot to the subject, but the Department of Sanitation actually does have some pilot programs. I don't know if they're actually being implemented, but to try to improve the efficiencies of particularly commercial waste removal.
I think we're getting a little off topic, and Jack Schmidt had a question that will go to you.
So you spoke primarily about deliveries, and I'm curious as to how you deal with the issue that I call serial returners. People that will buy an item of clothing or shoes in multiple sizes, keep them when they fit, send everything back. Do we have a sense of the number of packages that are delivered and then the number of packages that are subsequently returned, and that impact on us?
So I have not studied this issue locally. Jean Paul's study, he actually does have some data from his building of pickups, which I guess would be the stuff going back out, which shows some different time of day patterns. So I'm happy to connect you to that information. I would say nationally and internationally, it's a huge inefficiency in terms of freight movement is the amount of goods that are going back by return.
Okay, I think you'll be our last question.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, with the large buildings that you looked at, did any of them have their own parking facilities? And do you think that would make a difference in any of the numbers?
Yeah, so the ones we looked at, I think only one of them had a driveway. I don't know that it had like an off-street parking garage, but that's the only one that had any sort of off-street space. So the rest did not. That is a huge issue, and again, DCP and others in the room, there aren't loading dock requirements for residential buildings, and depending on the location, I'm not sure that's actually the best solution if we're talking about trucks crossing a sidewalk all the time, but it is absolutely something that needs to be looked at.
And in terms of resident parking, to the extent that may inform the shopping patterns that...
Yeah, and that's a big issue we're looking at right now with the demographics. Within the citywide mobility survey data, we do have car access information, and we are looking at that as a variable and how that influences the trade-offs that are happening.
Thank you, Dr. Conway. All right, now we'll move on to the next item on our agenda, which is the public participation. I did not receive any cards today. We will not have that section today. Now, let's move on to our action items. The first action item is to accept the synopsis of the previous meeting, which was held on August 27th, 2019. I'm requesting all members to announce your name and the agency you represent when you make a motion or second. Do I have a motion to accept the August 27th, 2019 meeting synopsis?
Naomi Klein, Westchester County.
Naomi Klein. Do I have a second?
Second.
All right. Is there any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? The motion passes. adoption of resolution number 493, transportation conformity determination for the federal fiscal year 2020 to 2024 transportation improvement program, and federal fiscal years 2018 to 2045 for the regional transportation plan as amended. All copies of the resolution are available on the on-assignment table. I'll ask Angelo Bonek to introduce the resolution.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here to introduce the resolution 493, Transportation Conformity Determination for Federal Fiscal Years 2020 to 2024 Transportation Improvement Program, or TIP, and for the fiscal years 2018 to 2045 Regional Transportation Plan as amended. So NYMTC staff had to undertake a conformity determination due to the pending adoption of a new regional transportation plan by the Orange County Transportation Council, which impacts the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, fine particulate matter of PM2.5 maintenance area and the Poughkeepsie, New York, also non-attainment area, both of which include parts of NYMTC planning area. Consequently, NYMTC has to conduct a conformity determination every time Orange County does one, and vice versa. We did a 30-day public review period, which was held from October 3rd, 2019 to November 1st, 2019. During the public review period, no public comments were received for the draft transportation conformity determination. So I'm requesting the PFAC members to adopt resolution 493, transportation conformity determination for federal fiscal year 2020 to 2024 TIP and for the fiscal year 2018 to 2045 RTB as amended. Thank you.
Thank you, Sangeeta. Do I have a motion to adopt resolution number 493, transportation conformity determination for federal fiscal year 2020 to 2024 and the transportation improvement program for federal fiscal year 2018 to 2045, the regional transportation plan as amended?
So moved, Jack Schmidt, New York City Planning.
Jack Schmidt moves the motion. Is there a second?
Second, Pat Burton.
Pat Burton seconds the motion. Is there any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? The motion passes. The next action item is the adoption of resolution number 493, amendments to the federal fiscal years 2018 to 2045 regional transportation plan for major projects. I'll ask Leslie Forger to introduce the resolution.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm here to introduce resolution 494. This resolution entails the addition of 5 projects to the Planning Scenario Plan 2045, which is basically a listing of all major projects, or most major projects in Plan 2045. Now, why do we need this amendment? Well, in the past few months or so, what has happened is that a few projects have either been added to the TIP or the program, or, they have exceeded over $100 million threshold. Now, per NYMTC operating procedures, if we have projects that exceed that threshold, in most cases, we'll need to add the Plan 2045 as a major project. So, the details are in the attachments. These are 5 projects. And NYMTC staff strongly recommend that we, in order to be consistent with NYMTC operating procedures, that we adopt this resolution. That is all.
Thank you, Leslie. Do I have a motion to adopt resolution number 494, amendments to the federal fiscal years 2018 to 2045 regional transportation plans for major projects?
So moved. Anne McGrain, New York City DOT.
Anne McGrain moves the motion. Is there a second?
Second.
San Francisco, Putnam County, second the motion. Is there any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? The motion passes. Okay. We are now moving on to the next action item is resolution number 495, amendments to the federal fiscal years 2018 to 2045 regional transportation plan to maintain fiscal constraint. Leslie Forger will also introduce.
Good afternoon. It's been a while. I'm here to discuss also resolution 495. This resolution will alter table 7.2 of chapter 7 of the current plan, which is Plan 2045. Why do we need this? Well, since we last met, the TIP has changed. in order to have the plan better reflect what's on the tip, but more importantly, to maintain fiscal constraint, NYMTC staff strongly recommends we adopt this resolution. That's all.
Thank you, Leslie. Do we have a motion to adopt resolution number 495, amendments to the federal fiscal years 2018 to 2045 regional transportation plan to maintain fiscal constraint?
So moved, Naomi Klein, Westchester County.
Thank you, Naomi. Do we have a second?
Second, Jack Schmidt, New York City Planning.
Thank you, Jack. Is there any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? This motion also passes. The final action item of the day is the adoption of resolution number 496, amendments to the state federal fiscal years 2019 to 2020 Unified Planning Work Program. It will be introduced by Seitu Allen.
Hi, good afternoon. So PFAC resolution number 496 redistributes funding between two core projects within Nassau County's program for the 2019-2020 State Fiscal Year Unified Planning Work Program. No new funds requested, and this action is consistent with the RTP. NYMTC staff requests that you adopt this resolution.
Thank you, Seitu. Do I have a motion to adopt resolution number 496, amendment to the state fiscal years 2019 to 2020 Unified Planning Work Program? Thank you, Bob. Do I have a second?
Second, Anne McGrain, New York City DOT.
Thank you, Ann. Is there any discussion? All in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? The motion passes. Our last item of the day is the confirmation of our next feedback meeting, which will be held here in this office on February 13th, 2020. Please note the meeting times changed. They will now begin at 11:30, and it will be held here in this office. Do I have a motion to adjourn the meeting?
So moved, Jack Schmidt, City Planning.
Thank you, Jack. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Bob. The meeting is now adjourned. Have a good day.